Hello and welcome to the 1/160th Photography Podcast. Today in this podcast I'm going to be talking about taking infinite white portraits or high key portraits. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, it makes a very pleasing portrait just to shoot against white and have brilliant white. It's a very modern and clean look, and it's very good for things like headshots. And it was really made famous by Steve Jobs, and it's been used loads and loads, not only in photography but in films and television interviews and commercials and things on YouTube. So it's a very popular look, and it's sort of quite classical at the moment. I don't think it will go out of fashion anytime soon. It'll look quite good black and white as well. But you're going to need flash to do it. In another episode, I'll talk about low-key photography. Now, there's a slight difference between high-key and low-key in terms of setup up front and setup after the shot. So with high-key, you do a lot of work before taking the picture, i.e. preparing things before taking the picture, but then editing is quite minimal. With low-key photography, or just shooting against a dark background, you do more editing afterwards, but it's actually quite simple to get it right in camera. And it is possible to get high-key photography right in camera, and really that's what I'm going to talk about today, getting it right in camera. So the first thing you're going to need is a suitable background. So you're going to need a white or at the very least a grey background. You could shoot against a wall, but you might have problems with white balance. And if you were just shooting against a wall that was sort of maybe a magnolia or an off shade of white, then you could easily correct that by changing the white balance. Now you could use corrective gels on the flash that illuminates your subject, but I'm not going to go there today. That's going to be far too complicated. So I'm going to talk exclusively about using white or grey backgrounds simply to avoid the problem of white balance later. So let's say we go for a white background. If we went for a grey background, we would just need a little bit more power, but we could get it to look white. So the first thing you're going to need is you're going to need a flash, or most likely you're going to need two flashes or more than one. The reason being, one flash won't give an even illumination of the background. Now, something you could do is you could put your flash in a softbox and you could put your person in front of the softbox, and you could do that for your high key. One of the other things with high key photography, particularly for portraits and headshots, is not all of the area needs to be white, simply because it's a very easy colour to paint in Photoshop. So if you only had half of it white, well, you can extend your picture by adding white in, or you can colour the rest in white with a white brush. It's very easy to do. I've done a podcast about backgrounds and I've talked about pop-ups, vinyl, paper. Let's just have paper. Let's have a simple bit of paper stuck on the wall with sellotape. That'll be nice and easy. So we would then need a flash to illuminate that. So we need a flash pointing at that white background. I would recommend having two flashes, one either side, so that you get an even illumination and you don't get any vignetting or dark corners. So you're going to need to put your flash on a light stand. Now I'm going to talk about using strobes, and I'm not going to really talk about using studio flashes. Strobes are more accessible, more people like to have them. So with your strobes, you're going to need something to trigger them. Again, I've briefly talked about this in other podcast episodes. You could use remote triggers or you could use slave function. Let's use triggers. It's simple. So we're going to need at least 3 flashes, 2 for the background and 1 for the model. Maybe we're going to have more, but let's keep it simple and have 3. So we're going to need 3 triggers to keep everything in sync. The advice I would give you for infinite white is to have your background 2 stops higher than your foreground. Let's put the model or whoever you're doing photography of in front of that background. Probably best to get them sat down if we're doing portraits and headshots, make them comfortable, etc. Now you need a light to illuminate them. You're going to need a big softbox to give soft light. That's going to work best. The background doesn't necessarily need a softbox. And if you're finding you're not getting good illumination, you can always move the lights backwards and forwards. Have them off at maybe 45 degrees from the background as well, if need to the side, so that they're not in the shot. Or you can have them directly behind the model so that they're blocked from being seen. So what would be a good f-stop for our portrait model? Let's make things easy and go for f5.6. So this is where metering comes in. So we need to set our flash so that it outputs enough light to get an even exposure at f5.6. And when using flash and multiple lights, it's best to set them individually. So put your flash in a softbox, put it on a stand, off to camera left or camera right. If preferable, if possible I should say, put it high and pointing down, and then trigger it and see what you get. Now, this is where a light meter comes in, and I have done an episode about light meters. Put your light meter in front of the model and keep adjusting your flash and test firing it until it gives you an aperture reading of f5.6. as we're using flash, you can have quite a high shutter speed. We're not just shooting indoors, and you can have a low ISO as well. So I would recommend ISO 100 or the base ISO for the cleanest output, and then anything really up to 1/200th of a second. In terms of lenses, that really is up to you. It depends what type of look you're going for, but you're probably going to go for 50 to 200, somewhere in between that. And so set your aperture to f5.6. Keep firing that flash and testing with the flash meter until you get to f5.6. There are other ways to do it, and you can do it in camera, but that's going to be the quickest, most accurate way to do it. So now our background lights need to be 2 stops higher. So after f5.6, the next one is f8, and the next one is f11. So we need to set our background lights to be f11. It's not the output that has to be at f11, it's the light that bounces back towards the camera. We're not testing the light that hits the background, we're testing the light that comes off the background. That's called reflected light rather than instant light. So we need to fire our 2 lights at the same time. The best thing to do is to start at the same power level as the flash that we've just set. I'm going to assume they're all on manual. It's going to be easier if they're all on manual actually. So let's say in our first flash that illuminates the model through the softbox, we set it at half power. Well, that's a good place to start with the other lights. Set them both at half power. Now obviously the light output needs to be more, but don't forget you're using 2 lights. So fire those 2 flashes at the same time and hold your light meter just away from the background. You want the light meter sensor to be hitting the background. And again, keep doing it and increasing or decreasing each flash, but keeping them the same until you get to an aperture on the light meter of f11. The other way you can do it is you can have the model move to the side, and you can keep taking pictures and increasing or decreasing the flash output of both flashes until you hit the clipping mark. And you'll see that because when you look at the picture and put your histogram on, it will flash a certain colour. On my cameras it's always flashed red, and that says it's hit clipping. It's hit completely white. It does the same for black, but I think it's a different colour. It's generally blue. With that in mind, you could do it the other way. You could set up your background, do the illumination until you get to clipping, work out what aperture value you've got, take 2 off, use that value to set the modelling light. So now we've got the model illuminated, we've got the background illuminated, and I'm going to talk about why we should go 2 stops over. Going 2 stops over for the background is safe, because what can happen is when you do high key shots against white, you look on the camera and it's white. You look on your computer and it's white. And then you go and print it and it's not all white, always right. Sometimes it's cream or a little bit yellowy. And the reason is you just can't tell by looking at it. But it might be sort of 97% white or 95% white. And when you look at it as a whole, it looks white. Or certain parts might not be fully white. So it's always best to check when you edit, say in Lightroom, put your clipping on and see which parts are completely white and which parts aren't. It's likely, unless you go 2 stops over, that you won't get completely white. If you don't get completely white, it's not a problem. You can edit it in Lightroom by adjusting the highlights. You can use a brush or gradient filter and you can just increase the exposure until you get clipping. And you can do it locally or globally. You might be raising some things on your model if you do it globally, but you can fix it in editing. But let's just talk about getting it right in camera. So if you were doing event photography and you were printing there and then, you'd want to get it right, and you want to get it right in the JPEG. So it's best to go 2 stops over. It saves time in editing. So now we've got it all set up. Our background is 2 stops overexposed. Our person will be correctly exposed, and now we start taking the photographs. One thing you will notice is you will get some light bleeding in around the model. And that means you're going to lose some detail in things like the hair. So if we drop the background light down, we'd see more detail on the side of the hair, around the ear. It doesn't matter if that detail is lost. It matters if too much detail is lost. If too much detail is being lost, maybe move your model a little bit further away from the background. You don't want that light to wrap around them. What you will notice as well is you get quite, even though you're using a softbox, you're getting quite a soft light, you'll get quite a lot of soft light as well, because once it comes off the background, it'll be bouncing around the room and hitting the model, so it'll be white. If you wanted to soften it more, you could put a reflector next to the model, underneath the model. If you wanted to add a bit more contrast to the face, you could put black flags or just a bit of black cloth or black material either side of the model, and that will give a bit more contrast. Now, the thing with shooting high key is it looks really professional because it's very difficult for the average person to do. But you can do it with minimal equipment, really. You need 2 or 3 flashes, but you can do it. We've looked at headshots and portraits. Now let's look at doing full body. If you can get your model to stand on a piece of white background, white paper, something white or something shiny, maybe some tiles, and you can get the background behind them, you'll need to illuminate the floor as well. So you need a 4th light. And then even if they're just not touching the edge of the paper, shoot it in portrait orientation. When you put it in Photoshop, you can put it in a canvas that is landscape orientation, and you can just paint in the white. And that way, it will look like you've taken their picture in a big studio. You need to make sure that they have some shadow. So when you fire your light at the floor, you don't want to overpower it, because if it looks like they don't have a shadow, it looks like they're just floating and you've just cut them out and stuck them against white, which doesn't look very good. So they need to have some shadow. Also, they might, if they're wearing shoes, they might leave sort of marks and you need to tidy those up, or sort of footprints. You need to tidy those up in Photoshop. It's very easy to do. Just paint over them with white again, as long as you don't mess up the shadow. So it's really easy to get a really easy, clean, professional image just doing high key. You can get products that do this. I talked about just putting a softbox as the background, or you could use a big umbrella, a parabolic umbrella. But you can get specialist products that do this, that you put the lights behind or inside and the lights shoot through. And one is Elastilite Highlight, spelled HI-LITE. I had one of those for a while and they're great. You could also buy a floor trail which goes along the floor and you can attach it with Velcro, and that's a shiny white surface as well. So you can take pictures on the highlight, you can do a bit of editing in Photoshop, and it looks like you've taken your portrait, your full body portrait, in a full professional studio with an infinite white curve. You had to do some work to sort of get the bit where the join of the trail and the highlight met. You had to sort of Photoshop that bit out, but it was minimal editing and the results looked really good. Other things you could do, you could get a shower curtain, put lights behind the shower curtain, fire them through the shower curtain, thus giving you the white background. And again, it doesn't matter if you've got creases or sort of imperfections, because the light will drown those out if it's 2 stops over. If it's not 2 stops over, you will get those imperfections showing through. So I hope you found this podcast about doing high key infinite white portraits useful. I do a lot of strobe work, and strobe work and portraits are my passion. So I'm really glad to have done this episode, and I would really appreciate it if you could leave a review for the show on iTunes. That would greatly help me out. Thank you. Goodbye.